The story of the Boer Wars doesn't start with the boom of cannons, but with the groan of wooden ships and the crackle of canvas sails, as a fleet of Dutch vessels navigated the treacherous waters around the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. On board were men who couldn't fathom the epic tale that would sprout from their modest trading post, a gripping story of bloodshed and land that would transform a continent and challenge the very foundations of the world's strongest empire. Leading this voyage was Jan van Riebeck, a determined merchant of the Dutch East India Company. His mission? Simply to set up a refreshment stop for ships journeying along the spice routes between Europe and the bountiful East Indies. The company's interests lay solely in profit, not in conquest. Yet as these settlers sowed their first seeds in the looming shadow of Table Mountain, they unknowingly planted the beginnings of a new society. The landscape that greeted them was ancient, its history stretching far beyond European memory. The Red Earth had seen the rise and fall of native kingdoms, the great migrations of the Bantu peoples, and the quiet endurance of the Khoisan. Now, it would witness the birth of something unprecedented, a new people, neither wholly European nor fully African, but something crafted in the heart of the southern wilderness. In the early years, the settlement clung to the coastline like a barnacle on a ship's hull. The company's strict rules and monopolistic hold left little room for free enterprise or dreams of expansion. But human desires are not easily stifled by corporate dictates. The first farmers, who would later call themselves Boers, from the Dutch word for farmer, began to venture inland, seeking fertile lands beyond the company's grasp. These pioneers were a bundle of contradictions, setting the stage for generations to come. They brought European Christianity into the wild, yet developed a belief that cast them as a chosen people, wandering in a promised land. They valued self-reliance, but relied on the labor of native peoples and imported servants. They resisted authority, yet created their own strict hierarchies. By the mid-18th century, the Trekboers, wandering farmers in the truest sense, had carved out a semi-nomadic life unlike anything seen in Europe. Entire families journeyed across vast distances in ox wagons, each one a mobile fortress carrying the vestiges of European civilization into what they saw as untamed land. Their lives played out under skies so expansive they seemed to swallow them whole, across plains where distance itself felt like a living entity. "Lord has guided us to this place," they would declare, voices rising above the creak of wagon wheels and the lowing of cattle, reading from well-worn Bibles. "And what the Almighty has given, no man may take away." These words, initially spoken in the melodic Dutch of the Netherlands, gradually evolved into the unique rhythms of Afrikaans, becoming both a prayer and a political manifesto. Life in isolation shaped their spirit, worn smooth and strong, like sandstone beneath constant wind. Cut off from European institutions, they established a form of direct governance through their commando system, where every man was both citizen and warrior, gathering to make decisions and protect their communities. Without formal courts, they administered rough justice through elected officials called landrosts and heemraden. Without professional clergy, they interpreted scripture for themselves, finding in the Old Testament tales of covenant and conquest that mirrored their own experience. Their dwellings, whitewashed homesteads called opstels, stood like islands in the vast ocean of the Veld. Inside, Dutch Delft pottery might sit alongside carved wooden furniture and animal hide rugs, European refinement adapting to African practicality. Outside, the distinctive Cape Dutch architecture with its curved gables created a new aesthetic, born of two worlds. Yet this outward movement did not occur in empty domains. The borderlands bristled with tension as mounted parties clashed with Xhosa warriors along the Fish River, while Khoisan groups alternately resisted and accommodated the newcomers. Unlike the genocidal pattern of North America, Southern Africa's contested spaces produced a complex web of struggle, cooperation, and coexistence. Mixed marriages occurred, particularly in the early years. Native knowledge of plants, animals, and geography became essential wisdom for survival. African words enriched the emerging dialect of the European settlers. The Slachter's Neck affair of 1815 served as bloody prelude to later antagonisms. When Frederick Bezuidenhout refused to appear before a magistrate on charges of mistreating a Khoisan servant, he was shot dead, resisting arrest. His brother Johannes gathered a small band of dissidents who were quickly overcome by government forces. 5 were hanged at a public execution where the gallows broke, forcing the condemned to face death twice, an incident remembered as emblematic of foreign callousness. Meanwhile, far to the north, the upheaval known as the Mafeking was transforming southern Africa's demographic landscape. The rise of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka sent waves of displacement across the subcontinent. Entire populations were uprooted and realigned, creating both power vacuums and new concentrations of strength. This tumult would later create conditions that enabled the Great Trek as European pioneers pushed into areas destabilized by these massive population shifts. The pivotal moment came in 1795, when revolutionary winds blowing from France transformed Europe's political landscape. The Netherlands fell to revolutionary forces, prompting Britain to seize the Cape to prevent it from becoming a French base. Though briefly returned to Dutch oversight, the settlement was permanently claimed by Britain in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. For the Dutch descended inhabitants, imperial rule brought unwelcome changes that cut to the heart of their society and self-understanding. The Crown's administration, infused with Enlightenment ideals and evangelical Christian reformism, implemented policies that seemed to threaten the very foundations of their way of life. When English missionaries arrived, especially those from the London Missionary Society, they brought an ideological challenge to European authority. Men like Johannes van der Kemp and John Philip advocated indigenous rights and condemned the treatment of local labourers. Through their influence, magistrates introduced circuit courts in 1811 to address abuses in rural areas, a system the Dutch descendants perceived as biased against them. To locals, the black circuit courts weren't just legal institutions, they were reminders of outside intrusion. Tales spread of white agriculturalists dragged before judges based on the testimony of their workers, forced to stand as equals beside those they considered divinely ordained to serve them. Whether exaggerated or accurate, these stories crystallized a sense of grievance that would fester for generations. Then came the thunderbolt that would permanently fracture Cape society, the abolition of bondage throughout the British Empire in 1834. The approximately 39,000 enslaved persons in the Cape were to be freed, with compensation offered to their owners. This moral victory for abolitionism struck many settlers as an attack on both their economic foundation and their social order. Adding insult to injury, the compensation payments were made available only in London, forcing claimants to use agents who charged substantial fees. "We are robbed twice," declared Piet Retief, whose voice would soon lead thousands into exile. "Once of our property, and again of our rightful payment." These agriculturalists, many already resentful of foreign authority, now had concrete economic grievances to complement their ideological objections. The stage was set for one of history's great exoduses. Between 1835 and 1840, approximately 15,000 Dutch-descended settlers, nearly a quarter of the Cape's European population, packed their possessions into ox wagons and headed north beyond the reach of imperial authority. This great trek would become the foundational epic of Afrikaner nationalism, their Exodus and Aeneid combined. They found themselves in a countryside that was equal parts stunning and harsh. The high Veld stretched before them, a sea of grass that rippled silver in the wind. Mountain ranges rose like the backbones of sleeping giants. Rivers carved paths through valleys where no European had set foot. Game animals darkened the plains in numbers that defied counting. Still, this apparent Eden harbored dangers, both natural and human. Lions took their toll on livestock and occasionally on the Voortrekkers themselves. Diseases unknown to European medicine felled young and old alike, and most significantly, the powerful African kingdoms that controlled the interior had no intention of surrendering their ancestral territories to these strange newcomers, with their thundering guns and rumbling wagons. The emigrant parties organized themselves into semi-autonomous groups, each following leaders like Hendrik Potgieter, Gerrit Maritz, and Piet Retief. Women and children journeyed alongside the men, enduring the same hardships and dangers. Their wagons, later immortalized as symbols of pioneer identity, formed protective circles at night, defensive formations that could repel attacks from predators, both animal and human. In February 1838, the journey's most tragic episode unfolded when Piet Retief led a delegation to negotiate with Dingaan, ruler of the Zulus. After appearing to grant access to the emigrants, Dingaan ordered his warriors to kill Retief and his party. The Zulu forces then attacked nearby encampments at Blukrans and Wienen, killing approximately 500 men, women, and children. The pioneers' response came at the confrontation of Blood River on December 16, 1838. A force of 470 Voortrekkers, led by Andries Pretorius, faced thousands of Zulu warriors beside the Encom River. Before the clash, they made a covenant with God, promising to commemorate the day forever if granted victory. Using their superior weaponry and defensive wagon formation, they repelled the attack without a single casualty among them, while approximately 3,000 Zulu warriors perished. The river ran red with blood, giving the confrontation its name, and providing the emigrants with a sacred narrative of divine deliverance that would sustain their nationalism for generations. Beyond Zulu domains, the Voortrekkers established Natalia on the eastern coast. Further inland, they founded the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, Transvaal. These fledgling entities represented the fulfillment of their quest for self-governance, autonomous regions administered by their own people according to their own laws. Their governmental systems reflected their pastoral experience. The Volksraad, People's Council, embodied their commitment to a form of direct participation, albeit one limited to white male citizens. Their constitutions explicitly rejected racial equality and established Protestant Christianity as the foundation of their societies. Without resources for elaborate administrative structures, these regions remained loosely organized, with authority often residing in local communities rather than central leadership. However, the imperial powers had no intention of allowing autonomous entities to control potential harbors or threaten their interests. In 1843, they annexed Natalia as a crown possession, forcing many emigrants to pack their wagons once more and head inland to join their compatriots in the interior. This pattern of migration, followed by annexation, established the fundamental rhythm of antagonism that would culminate in the wars that followed. The Sand River, 1852, and Bloemfontein, 1854, conventions temporarily halted this cycle. Through these agreements, Britain formally recognized the autonomy of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, seemingly accepting the permanent existence of self-governing European enclaves in southern Africa. But these treaties contained the seeds of future strife, particularly in provisions regarding native policy and boundary disputes. For 2 decades, these autonomous regions developed in relative isolation. Their economies remained predominantly agricultural, based on cattle ranching and subsistence cultivation. Without access to the sea, they conducted trade through Portuguese East Africa or via imperial possessions, leaving them vulnerable to economic pressure. Their populations grew slowly, boosted occasionally by new arrivals from the Cape, who shared their desire for independence from foreign control. Life in these young societies blended elements of their Dutch heritage with innovations born of necessity. The distinctive homestead emerged, a self-sufficient microcosm featuring a main house, separate kitchen, storerooms, workshops, and quarters for workers. Around these estates, the commando evolved from its origins as an ad hoc defensive force into the primary military institution. Every male citizen between 16 and 60 was obligated to provide his own horse, rifle, ammunition, and provisions when called to service. Their isolation fostered a distinctive way of life. The Dutch Reformed Church provided spiritual and social coherence, with predicants, ministers, serving as both religious and community leaders. Their dialect evolved from Dutch, incorporating elements of Portuguese, Malay, Khoisan, and Bantu languages. Folk music, using instruments like the concertina, accompanied social gatherings, while oral storytelling preserved family and community histories. Learning remained largely informal, with itinerant teachers moving between estates to provide basic literacy. Biblical instruction centered on scripture, which many households could recite with remarkable precision despite limited formal education. This scriptural knowledge reinforced their self-image as a chosen people in a promised land, guided by divine providence through trials comparable to those of ancient Israel. Meanwhile, imperial strategy in southern Africa continued evolving in ways that would eventually threaten the autonomy of these interior societies. The discovery of diamonds near Kimberley in 1867 dramatically altered the region's economic landscape. Suddenly, this previously marginal area attracted international attention, investment, and migrants. The Crown, never having fully abandoned its vision of a unified South Africa under imperial oversight, saw the diamond fields as an opportunity to reassert its influence. The Transvaal, already struggling with financial difficulties and tensions with indigenous populations, faced a critical test when annexed by Britain in 1877. Shepstone, the Imperial Commissioner, justified this action as necessary to protect the region from Zulu threats and to rescue it from bankruptcy. While some inhabitants welcomed protection, many viewed it as an intolerable violation of their hard-won autonomy. As the shadow of imperial ambition once again fell across their homelands, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers faced a stark choice: submission or defiance. Their decision would ignite a struggle that would shake the foundations of the world's greatest empire and forever transform the landscape of southern Africa. The wilderness crucible had forged a people unlike any other, European in origin, but African in experience, fiercely autonomous yet deeply communal, technologically limited yet adaptable and resilient. They had already abandoned one homeland in search of freedom. They would not relinquish another without a fight that would echo across continents and through the corridors of history for generations to come. The shadow of foreign ambition fell across the South African Republic like a cold eclipse. In the spring of 1877, Sir Theophilus Shepstone rode into the capital with 25 mounted policemen and a small contingent of clerical staff, a force so modest it seemed more diplomatic mission than conquering army. Yet within weeks, this unimposing envoy had accomplished what thousands of soldiers might have failed to achieve. With a flourish of his pen, he proclaimed the acquisition of the territory, extinguishing its autonomy without firing a single shot. Disaster didn't strike in isolation. The Republic buckled under a perfect mix of crises converging at the worst possible time. President Thomas Francois Berger's administration teetered on the brink of financial collapse, its treasury depleted by failed railway projects and ambitious modernization schemes. Sekou Kune, leader of the Pedi people, had inflicted humiliating defeats on mounted defense forces, exposing the state's military weakness. Rumors swirled of imminent Zulu attacks from the east. Against this backdrop of crises, Shepstone's promise of stability and protection appeared to some as salvation rather than subjugation. Addressing the Volksraad, Shepstone presented the annexation as protection rather than conquest. His speech carried the weight of the Crown's dominions behind its reasonable tone, suggesting that autonomy had proven too costly a luxury, one threatening not only their security, but the stability of all southern Africa. At first, the people were split, some hopeful, others deeply wary. Urban merchants and recent immigrants welcomed the promise of economic stability and crown protection. But in the scattered farmsteads across the high Veld, where memories of the Great Trek still burned bright, the foreign takeover struck like a physical blow. These were men and women whose parents and grandparents had crossed mountains and rivers, faced lions and warriors, buried children in unmarked graves, all to escape the very authority that now claimed their hard-won homeland. Paul Kruger, Vice President of the Republic, an embodiment of Afrikaner values, witnessed these events with a stoic dignity that barely concealed his smouldering rage. His broad face, framed by a patriarchal beard and creased by decades of sun and hardship, betrayed little emotion as he addressed his compatriots. His words reminded them that their strength had never been in weapons or wealth, but in their faith and unyielding desire for freedom. This test, he assured them, would find them equal to those that came before. Officials from London initially responded to scattered protests with bemused condescension. Lord Carnarvon, architect of a grand federation scheme for southern Africa, dismissed Afrikaner objections as the grumbling of backward farmers who failed to appreciate the benefits of modern governance. In his correspondence with colleagues, he expressed confidence that the inhabitants would soon recognize the advantages of civilization, and that a firm hand and gentle guidance would bring them into the fold of progress. This profound misreading of Afrikaner character would prove catastrophic. Far from accepting their incorporation into the empire, the annexed population organized passive opposition with methodical determination. 3 delegations journeyed to London to present their grievances directly to the Crown, each rebuffed with diplomatic courtesy but resolute denial. The bearded statesman led 2 of these missions, his blunt farmer's speech and biblical references striking English politicians as quaint anachronisms rather than expressions of unwavering resolve. The Veld whispered with conspiracy as farmers gathered after church services and during family celebrations to plan their response. Secret committees formed in each district, stockpiling ammunition and maintaining communications through coded messages. Women whose ancestors had melted lead into bullets during the Great Trek again took up the task of arming their men for the coming struggle. Children served as lookouts and messengers, their innocent appearances concealing their crucial role in the underground network. When Gladstone's Liberal government came to power in 1880, it sparked a flicker of hope that diplomacy might prevail. During his Midlothian campaign, Gladstone had condemned the forced acquisition in strong terms, characterizing it as an unwise and nearly insane position for a monarchy to place itself in, attempting to coerce the free subjects of a republic. Yet once in office, the practical difficulties of relinquishing colonial gains tempered Gladstone's principled rhetoric. Colonial Secretary Lord Kimberley wrote to the Afrikaner leadership expressing regret that abandonment was impracticable, citing obligations to English settlers and indigenous populations. The final diplomatic avenue had closed, leaving only the language of violence to resolve the impasse. The spark that ignited the conflagration came from an unexpected quarter. In the farming district of Potchefstroom, a tax dispute erupted when Piet Bezuidenhout refused to pay his assessment in full. When his wagon was seized for auction, a crowd of armed farmers, led by Piet Cronje, reclaimed it by force, humiliating the Crown officials. Sir Owen Lanyon, the colonial administrator, dispatched troops to arrest the ringleaders, unwittingly setting the stage for armed insurrection. On December the 16th, 1880, deliberately chosen as the anniversary of the Blood River Covenant, thousands gathered at Paardekraal, their wagons forming a great circle reminiscent of protective formations that had sheltered their ancestors. There they swore solemn oaths to restore their autonomy or perish in the attempt. Each man added a stone to a growing cairn, a physical manifestation of their collective resolve that would stand as monument to their cause. Kruger, Joubert, and Pretorius, newly chosen to lead, stood before the crowd, their voices steady with resolve. Their message framed the struggle in stark moral terms, suggesting that a nation abandoning liberty through fear deserved contempt, but one voluntarily surrendering its liberty deserved double condemnation. The declaration was punctuated by the thunder of horses' hooves as messengers rode out across the Veld, carrying orders to fighting units throughout the territory. On December 16th, as crowds assembled at Paardekraal, news of the Republic's re-establishment reached the administrative heart of the territory. Crown representatives received the document with incredulous disdain. Sir Owen Lanyon, who had once boasted he could defeat all Afrikaner defiance with a mere wave of his glove, now faced an organized uprising with only scattered garrisons at his disposal. What followed would shatter the myth of European military invincibility and revolutionize tactical thinking across the globe. The first clash came at Bronkhorstspruit on December 20th, when Colonel Philippaan Struther led a column of the 94th Regiment toward the capital, their red coats vivid against the golden grass of the high Veld. Commandant Franz Joubert intercepted the column with a force of mounted burghers who seemed more hunting party than military unit. Joubert sent a messenger under white flag requesting that Anstruther turn back. When the colonel refused, a whistle sounded across the Veld. Within minutes, deadly accurate rifle fire poured into the European ranks from hidden positions. Anstruther fell wounded almost immediately. Of the 259 soldiers, 155 became casualties within 15 minutes. The survivors raised the white flag, having never even seen their attackers clearly enough to return effective fire. The disaster at Bronkhorstspruit sent shockwaves through European military establishments. Here was a new kind of warfare, not the shoulder-to-shoulder formations of traditional battlefields, but dispersed marksmen exploiting terrain and superior marksmanship to devastating effect. Each Afrikaner fighter brought to battle a lifetime of hunting experience, where ammunition was precious and every shot had to count. Their Wesley Richards and Martini Henry rifles became extensions of their bodies, familiar tools wielded with deadly precision. Garrison towns found themselves besieged by citizen soldiers who seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. Unlike conventional armies that could be defeated in set-piece battles, these mounted fighters operated with a fluid mobility that frustrated European commanders. They struck without warning, vanished before counterattacks could be mounted, and lived off the land without cumbersome supply lines. In response, the colonial authorities sent Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley, a respected officer known more for his intellect than battlefield grit against guerrilla fighters. Gathering available troops from Natal, the general prepared to march to the relief of the besieged outposts with supreme confidence in European military superiority. In correspondence with his superiors, Colley dismissed the farmers as merely good shots who knew nothing of real warfare. This fatal underestimation would soon be written in blood across the hills of the Drakensberg. The general's first attempt to break through Afrikaner positions came at Laing's Neck on January 28, 1881. The pass, a narrow saddle between imposing heights, was defended by riflemen under General Pierre Joubert. Rather than seeking an alternative route, the English commander ordered a frontal assault up the steep slopes toward entrenched positions. The 58th Regiment advanced in traditional formation, their discipline impeccable as they marched into a storm of accurate rifle fire. It was a calculated massacre, with no real contest. Marksmen targeted officers first, creating chaos in the European ranks. When mounted troops attempted to outflank the position, they found themselves channeled into killing grounds, where concentrated fire dropped men and horses in tangled heaps. By noon, the advancing force had lost 150 men, killed or wounded, against minimal losses for the defenders. The military leadership ordered a retreat, confidence shaken but determination unbroken. A week later, at Schuinschukte, the Queen's forces again encountered Afrikaner fighters, while attempting to clear the road to besieged towns. What began as a skirmish escalated into a desperate fight, as mounted burghers converged from multiple directions. European soldiers, trained in volley fire against massed enemies, found themselves targeted by opponents they could barely see. By nightfall, the general was forced to withdraw, leaving another 139 casualties on the field. These defeats might have prompted a more cautious commander to await reinforcements before further action. But the military leader, acutely aware that his reputation hung in the balance, conceived a bold plan to outmaneuver the defensive positions. Under cover of darkness, on February 26th, he led a mixed force of 350 men to the summit of Majuba Hill, an imposing mountain overlooking the main Afrikaner encampment. By dawn, his troops controlled the high ground, and victory seemed assured. Looking down from their commanding position, European officers could see the camp stirring like a disturbed anthill as the farmers realized their vulnerability. Some began hitching oxen to wagons, apparently preparing to retreat. The general, watching through his field glasses, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The scientific application of conventional military principles would, after all, triumph over irregular forces. What happened next would enter the annals of military history as a revolutionary demonstration of adaptive tactics against textbook strategy. Rather than retreating, the Republican commanders organized a multi-pronged ascent of the mountain. Johannes Joubert led one group up a blind approach, using dead ground to shield their advance. Nicholas Smith took another party up a steep ravine deemed unclimbable by military scouts. Other groups provided covering fire, pinning down soldiers while the assault teams worked their way up the slopes. The European forces, positioned for conventional defense against an enemy expected to mass for attack, found themselves picked off by hunters who utilized every scrap of cover. Farmers accustomed to stalking wary game applied these skills to deadly effect against soldiers trained for European battlefields. They moved in small groups, communicating through predetermined signals, each man advancing independently toward the summit. By midday, Afrikaner fighters had reached the crest at multiple points. The battle dissolved into desperate close-quarters fighting, with European discipline crumbling under the psychological shock of enemies appearing where none should have been able to reach. The English leader, attempting to rally his forces, fell with a bullet through his forehead. Leaderless and outmaneuvered, so the remaining troops broke and fled down the mountainside, many dying on the steep slopes they had climbed so confidently hours before. Majuba Hill ended in disaster, leaving nearly 300 European casualties, with 93 dead on the field. The Republican forces lost just 1 killed and 5 wounded. Beyond the tactical disaster, the psychological impact proved devastating to European prestige. A professional colonial force, led by a distinguished general, had been utterly defeated by citizen soldiers with no formal military training. The myth of European military invincibility, a cornerstone of colonial authority, lay shattered among the rocks of Majuba. News of the disaster reached London as peace negotiations were already underway. Gladstone's government, sobered by the unexpectedly fierce opposition and facing criticism for the campaign, chose pragmatism over pride. Rather than dispatching the massive reinforcements needed to crush the uprising, a course advocated by rising colonial voices like Cecil Rhodes, they opted for a negotiated settlement. The Convention of Pretoria, signed on August 3rd, 1881, represented an ambiguous compromise. The territory regained self-government in domestic affairs, while remaining under foreign suzerainty in external relations. This deliberately vague term would later become a point of bitter contention. For the moment, however, the guns fell silent and the citizen soldiers returned to their farms, victorious but wary of foreign intentions. Though victory was theirs, the Republican leadership spoke to the worn faces before them with a blend of relief, pride, and somber reflection. Their message balanced celebration with caution, acknowledging that while liberty had been restored, it remained unsecured. They had taught their opponents they could not be conquered, but those same foes had yet to learn they could not be ruled. In military circles across Europe, the brief conflict generated intense analysis. Here was a citizen militia that had defeated professional soldiers through superior marksmanship, mobility, and tactical innovation. The defensive system, where men brought their own weapons, horses, and supplies, operated without elaborate command structures, and utilized intimate knowledge of terrain, offered a new model of warfare that seemed particularly suited to defensive operations by smaller nations. German, French, and Russian military observers studied the reports with particular interest. The implications extended beyond the tactical to the strategic and political. How vulnerable were extended colonial possessions to determined local opposition? If South African farmers could defeat European regulars, what might happen in India, Egypt, or other territories if similar defiance emerged? In England itself, the disaster prompted military reforms that would bear fruit in later conflicts. Training emphasized marksmanship over parade ground drill. Khaki uniforms replaced conspicuous red coats. Tactical doctrine began the long evolution toward fire and movement techniques that acknowledged the dominance of the rifle over traditional formations. Yet perhaps the most significant consequence lay in the psychological realm. The Afrikaners, already possessed of a powerful national mythology rooted in their Great Trek and Covenant theology, now added a martial element to their self-conception. They had faced the world's greatest empire and emerged victorious. Divine providence, they believed, had once again demonstrated their special status as a chosen people in their promised land. This quasi-religious interpretation of their victory would sustain them through darker days to come. For while the First Anglo-Boer War had concluded, it represented merely the opening chapter in a longer struggle. The discovery of the world's richest gold deposits on the Witwatersrand would soon transform the agrarian republic into a prize beyond imperial imagination. New players would enter the contest: mining magnates, foreign investors, and masses of immigrant workers, all altering the balance of power that had been so dearly established at Majuba Hill. As the triumphant burghers dispersed to their scattered homesteads, few could have predicted that their next confrontation with empire would test their nation to its very foundations. The blood that stained the Veld in this brief, sharp conflict was but a prelude to the deluge that would follow, when the full might of colonial power would return, determined to erase the humiliation of Majuba from historical memory. The statesman, watching foreign forces withdraw from Republican outposts, told his aide words that would prove prophetic. His metaphor compared the departing adversaries to vultures that had not truly departed but merely flown to a nearby tree, watching and waiting to return. In the depths of the Witwatersrand, where ancient rivers once carved their serpentine paths through primordial stone, fate had buried a treasure that would reshape the destiny of nations. The year 1886 dawned like any other upon the rolling high Veld, yet beneath the earth's weathered surface lay precious metal, not the scattered flakes that had teased prospectors for decades, but an unimaginable reef of auriferous ore stretching like a golden spine across the backbone of Africa. George Harrison, a humble Australian digger whose calloused hands had sifted through countless streams in search of fortune, struck his pick into what appeared to be ordinary outcropping rock. The metallic gleam that answered his blow would echo through the corridors of empire, awakening ambitions that had slumbered in the hearts of men across 2 continents. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire across the Veld, carrying with it the intoxicating promise of wealth beyond measure. Within months, the quiet farmlands of the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek transformed into a seething cauldron of human ambition. Johannesburg rose from the red earth like a phoenix of canvas and corrugated iron, its streets teeming with fortune seekers from every corner of the globe. Englishmen rubbed shoulders with Germans, Americans with Russians, all united in their fevered pursuit of the auriferous dream. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility, heavy with the dust of 1,000 dreams being born and dying with each passing day. Paul Kruger, the patriarch of the Transvaal state, watched this transformation with eyes that had witnessed the Great Trek's tribulations and the First War's bitter lessons. His weathered face, carved by decades of frontier hardship, bore the weight of prophecy. The old lion understood that this discovery would either elevate his people to unprecedented heights or doom them to destruction beneath the grinding wheels of imperial ambition. The precious metal that promised salvation carried within its gleaming heart the seeds of catastrophe. The deep-level extraction that this reef demanded bore no resemblance to the surface diggings of earlier discoveries. These were not the shallow workings where a man with a pick and pan might strike it rich, but industrial undertakings requiring massive capital investment, sophisticated machinery, and armies of skilled workers. The Boer farmers, masters of the Veld and the Commando, found themselves strangers in this new world of stamps and shafts, of compound systems and corporate boardrooms. Into this vacuum of expertise and capital stepped titans of industry whose names would become synonymous with both vast riches and ruthless ambition. Cecil Rhodes, the colossus who bestrode the diamond fields of Kimberley like a modern Alexander, cast his imperial gaze northward toward the auriferous reef. His vision encompassed not merely personal enrichment, but the painting of the map read from Cape Town to Cairo, a dream of London's dominion that would unite the continent under the Union Jack. Beside the Cape magnate stood other giants of the extractive world. Alfred Beit, the quiet German financier, whose calculating mind could reduce entire nations to columns of figures. Barney Barnato, the Cockney comedian turned Diamond King, who understood that in Africa, as on the stage, timing was everything. And a host of lesser moguls who swarmed to the reef like moths to flame. These men brought with them not only the capital necessary to unlock the Witwatersrand's treasures, but also the cosmopolitan outlook of empire, the assumption that London's interests and global progress were one and the same. The Wheatlanders, the foreigners, soon outnumbered the Boer citizens in their own state. In the streets of the new city, English predominated over Dutch, pounds sterling over the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek's currency. The newcomers brought with them the latest technologies, the most advanced extraction techniques, and an unshakable confidence in their own superiority. They also brought their grievances, their demands, and their barely concealed contempt for the pastoral nation that had the audacity to govern them. Backed into a corner, the old administration faced choices that all led to loss. The extractive industry generated the revenue that transformed the Transvaal from a bankrupt frontier territory into the wealthiest state in southern Africa. The taxes levied upon the mines filled the nation's coffers, funded its railways, and armed its military. Yet this very prosperity came at the cost of the state's soul, diluting the pure Dutch character that the Voortrekkers had died to preserve. He replied with a quiet defiance, shaped by years of surviving the wild edges of the world. If the Uitlanders wished to enjoy the benefits of his state's protection, they must contribute to its welfare through levies. If they desired the vote, they must prove their loyalty through naturalization and residence. The explosive monopoly that his administration maintained ensured that the dangerous substance necessary for deep-level extraction flowed through Boer-controlled channels, generating revenue while maintaining strategic control over the industry's most crucial supply. The railway rates that favored the Delagoa Bay line over the Cape-controlled coastal routes represented more than mere economic policy. They embodied the nation's assertion of sovereignty, its determination to maintain access to the sea through Portuguese territory, rather than submit to Cape commercial hegemony. Every ton of precious metal that travelled to Lourenço Marques, rather than Cape Town or Durban, was a declaration of autonomy, a golden thread connecting the landlocked state to the wider world beyond London's control. But the Uitlanders chafed under these restrictions like thoroughbreds bridled by inexperienced riders. They had come to Africa to make their fortunes, not to submit to the governance of what they perceived as backward farmers. In their clubs and drawing rooms, over brandy and cigars, they spoke of the absurdity of levies without representation, of the inefficiency of Boer administration, of the crying need for intervention to establish proper order in this chaotic goldfield. As the months passed, politics grew hotter, sharper, and harder to ignore. The Uitlanders organized themselves into reform committees, drafted petitions, and appealed to Whitehall for protection of their interests. They spoke the language of rights and representation, of civilization and progress. But beneath these noble phrases lurked the harder reality of pounds and profits. The extractive magnates had not invested millions in the Witwatersrand to see their returns diminished by the whims of Dutch farmers. Cecil Rhodes, from his mansion in Cape Town, surveyed the situation with the calculating eye of a chess master positioning his pieces for the final assault. As Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, he commanded legitimate governmental authority. As the dominant figure in the diamond fields, he controlled vast riches. As the founder of the chartered company bearing his name, he wielded quasi-imperial authority across vast territories to the north. The Transvaal state, isolated and surrounded by Cape territory, seemed ripe for absorption into his expanding domain. The plan that the Cape Premier conceived bore the hallmarks of his grandiose vision and fatal overconfidence. Leander Starr Jameson, his trusted lieutenant, and a man whose loyalty matched his reckless courage, would lead a column of company police from the Bechuanaland border. Simultaneously, the Uitlanders would rise in the new city, overwhelming the Boer authorities through sheer numbers and righteous indignation. The state would collapse like a house of cards, and Cape rule would be established with minimal bloodshed and maximum profit. What followed unfolded like one of history's great tragedies. Noble aims twisted by pride, and careful schemes undone by all too human flaws. In the drawing rooms of the Golden City, prominent Uitlanders pledged their support for the coup. Arms were smuggled into the settlement, hidden in extraction equipment and household goods. Secret meetings were held by candlelight, where men who had never fired a shot in anger planned the overthrow of a government that had ruled through 2 conflicts and countless crises. Yet the very success that had brought these men to Africa now worked against them. Comfortable in their riches and secure in their superiority, they had forgotten the harsh lessons that had forged their Boer neighbours. They had mistaken the state's tolerance for weakness, its patience for incapacity. They had failed to understand that beneath the veneer of pastoral simplicity lay the iron will of a people who had trekked across a continent to preserve their autonomy. The patriarch's intelligence network, inherited from decades of frontier warfare, penetrated the conspiracy with ease. The old statesman knew of the plot's existence long before the raiders crossed the border. He watched the preparations with the calm of a hunter who has already selected his prey, allowing the trap to be set before closing it with devastating effect. On the last day of 1895, as the world prepared to welcome a new year, the Cape Doctor led his column of 600 men across the Transvaal border. The march that followed became a masterpiece of military incompetence, a comedy of errors that would have been laughable had its consequences not been so grave. The promised uprising in the Golden City never materialized, leaving the raiders to advance into hostile territory without local support. The Boer commandos, alerted by their government spies, tracked the column like wolves shadowing a wounded buck. At Doornkop, the inevitable reckoning came. Surrounded by Boer marksmen who had learned their trade in the harsh school of frontier warfare, the Doctor's column found itself trapped in a killing ground with no hope of escape. The surrender that followed was as inevitable as sunrise, yet it carried consequences that would reverberate across the globe. The telegram that Kaiser Wilhelm II sent to the Patriarch, congratulating the statesman on his defense of the state's sovereignty, transformed a local scandal into an international crisis. The Jameson raid's failure marked the beginning of the end for any hope of peaceful resolution between London and the Transvaal. The conspiracy had exposed the depth of imperial ambition and the lengths to which the empire would go to achieve its objectives. For the Boers, it confirmed their deepest suspicions about Cape intentions and their own vulnerability to imperial aggression. For Whitehall, it represented an unacceptable humiliation that demanded redress. In the aftermath of the raid, the political landscape of southern Africa shifted like sand in a desert storm. Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary whose fierce imperial ambitions matched his ruthless pragmatism, found himself implicated in the scandal, yet determined to salvage London's interests from the wreckage. The parliamentary inquiry that followed became a masterpiece of political theatre, with the Cape Premier and his conspirators portrayed as misguided patriots rather than criminal conspirators. The appointment of Alfred Milner as High Commissioner for South Africa in 1897 marked the beginning of the final act in the drama of imperial expansion. The new proconsul brought to his position the intellectual arrogance of the Oxford-educated civil servant, combined with the missionary zeal of the true believer in London's supremacy. He viewed the Transvaal state not as a legitimate government, but as an obstacle to progress, a rustic anachronism that stood in the way of rational administration and economic development. Where previous representatives had sought accommodation with the Boer republics, the High Commissioner pursued confrontation with the methodical determination of a man convinced of his own righteousness. He understood that the empire's credibility throughout the world depended upon its ability to impose its will upon these troublesome farmers. The failure to annex the Transvaal would encourage resistance from Ireland to India, from Egypt to Australia. The global empire required local dominance, and local dominance required the submission of the old patriarch. The negotiations that followed became a diplomatic dance of death, with each side maneuvering for position while preparing for the confrontation that both knew to be inevitable. The proconsul's demands escalated with each exchange, from modest reforms to wholesale transformation of the state's political system. The voting rights that he claimed to champion for the Uitlanders became a weapon to destroy Boer political control, a means of drowning the nation's founding population in a sea of naturalized foreigners. Even with the weight of years and duty upon him, he moved through the realm of diplomacy like a seasoned tactician. He offered concessions calculated to expose London's intentions while maintaining the state's essential character. The 7-year naturalization that he proposed would have granted political rights to the Uitlanders while preserving Boer political control. The climbing scale of levies that he suggested would have addressed Cape economic grievances while maintaining the nation's fiscal autonomy. Rather than easing tensions, every Boer concession only invited new pressures from across the sea. The proconsul's appetite for control grew with feeding, his vision of imperial dominance expanding to encompass not merely political reform, but complete cultural transformation. The English language would replace Dutch in the schools and courts. London's law would supersede Roman Dutch jurisprudence. The pastoral state would be reborn as a modern industrial territory under imperial tutelage. The Executive Council, established to address the mounting crisis, reflected the nation's growing desperation. The old men who had led the Great Trek found themselves facing a challenge that transcended their experience and threatened their very existence. The commando system that had served them so well in frontier warfare seemed inadequate to the industrial scale of modern confrontation. The financial resources that the precious metal had brought to the state paled before the limitless wealth of the global empire. Yet even as the nation's leaders contemplated the approaching storm, they drew strength from the knowledge that their cause was just. They had not sought this confrontation, had not coveted their neighbors' lands, had not demanded the submission of foreign peoples. They asked only to be left alone, to govern themselves according to their own lights, to preserve the autonomy that their fathers had purchased with blood and sacrifice. As the last days of calm slipped by, both camps readied themselves with the tools and tactics of a new, mechanized kind of war. The Boer commandos, reinforced by German advisors and equipped with the latest Mauser rifles, represented the marriage of traditional frontier skills with modern military technology. The Imperial forces, drawn from across the empire and commanded by generals schooled in the colonial campaigns of the previous century, embodied the confidence of a world dominion that had never known defeat. As 1899 dawned, The atmosphere in both the capital and Cape Town crackled with the electricity of approaching storm. The diplomatic exchanges continued, but they had become mere theatre. A formal dance performed for the benefit of world opinion, while both sides positioned their armies for the inevitable confrontation. The precious metal that had promised to elevate the Transvaal to greatness now seemed destined to become its funeral pyre. The Uitlanders, caught between their desire for political rights and their fear of civil strife, found themselves increasingly irrelevant to the great game being played around them. Their grievances had become the excuse for imperial ambition, their aspirations the justification for conquest. The extractive magnates who had orchestrated the crisis watched with growing unease as their carefully laid plans spiraled beyond their control. In the rural districts of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, the Boer farmers prepared for battle with the methodical care of men who understood that their survival depended upon their own skill and courage. They cleaned their weapons, checked their ammunition, and said their prayers. They kissed their wives and children goodbye, knowing that many would never return to the homesteads they had carved from the wilderness. The final declaration that the Patriarch's administration delivered to Whitehall on October 9th, 1899, marked the end of a chapter in African history that had begun with the landing of Van Riebeck at the Cape nearly 2.5 centuries earlier. The terms were simple and clear. All Imperial troops must withdraw from the Transvaal's borders within 48 hours, and all reinforcements that had arrived since June 1st must be removed from South Africa entirely. London's response was equally clear. The declaration was rejected with contempt. As the sun set on October 11th, 1899, the last day of peace settled over the African Veld like a shroud. In the distance, the lights of the Golden City twinkled like fallen stars, each one representing dreams and ambitions that would soon be tested in the crucible of battle. The precious metal that had brought prosperity to the Transvaal now seemed to mock the state's leaders, its gleam reflecting the fires of the approaching conflagration. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not merely the fate of two small republics, but the future of empire itself. The industrial might of London, the greatest dominion the world had ever known, would be matched against the desperate courage of a people fighting for their sovereignty. The outcome would reshape the map of Africa, transform the nature of warfare, and echo through the corridors of history for generations to come. In the gathering darkness, the first shots of the Second Anglo-Boer War were only hours away. The road to battle that had begun with the discovery of precious metal on the Witwatersrand was finally reaching its destination. The reckoning that both sides had long anticipated was at hand, and with it would come revelations that would shatter the certainties of an age and herald the birth of a new world, born from the ashes of the old. As cannon fire rolled across the South African landscape, it carried with it the unmistakable sound of history turning toward a new era of conflict. That morning, as the mist receded and columns of men pushed forward beneath glinting steel, the battlefield declared a new truth. War had changed, and with it, the rules of power and empire. From the kopjes overlooking the Natal border, Republican fighters watched the approach of destiny with the steady gaze of men who had measured their lives against the unforgiving African frontier. These were not the ragged irregulars that London's generals expected to scatter before disciplined volleys, but citizen soldiers equipped with the finest armaments European arsenals could provide. Each burgher carried a German Mauser rifle, whose accuracy would soon humble the pride of empire, while their knowledge of the terrain transformed every ridge and donga into a potential fortress. The strategic genius of the Republican leadership revealed itself in those first crucial weeks, as 3 simultaneous offensives unfolded, with the precision of a master chess player, moving multiple pieces in perfect coordination. While the world's attention focused on the dramatic encirclements that would soon capture headlines across the globe, the true brilliance of the Boer strategy lay not in conquest, but in paralysis, the systematic immobilization of vast London armies through calculated audacity. At Mafeking, on the northwestern frontier, the garrison found itself surrounded by mounted riflemen who transformed the sleepy railway town into a symbol that would echo through the corridors of Westminster. The encirclement that Baden-Powell would later mythologize began not as a heroic last stand, but as a strategic masterstroke, the pinning of precious crown troops by a relatively small Republican force under the command of Piet Cronje, whose weathered face bore the scars of a lifetime spent perfecting the art of frontier warfare. Taking Kimberley wasn't just about seizing a mining town. It was a move loaded with political and symbolic weight. Here lay the personal domain of Cecil Rhodes himself, the colossus whose ambitions had helped precipitate this very conflict. The sight of the great manipulator trapped within his own creation, reduced to the same desperate circumstances as any other besieged citizen, carried a poetic justice that was not lost on either side. The mounted riflemen who established their lines around the city understood that they held hostage not merely a strategic position, but the very embodiment of capitalism itself. Only at Ladysmith did the depth and precision of the Republic's military planning truly reveal itself. This was no remote frontier outpost, but a major depot, containing substantial armies under the command of Sir George White, a veteran of campaigns across 3 continents. The methodical encirclement of the town by fighters under Juba's overall direction represented the most audacious gambit in the Republican arsenal, the neutralization of an entire division through blockade rather than battle. The psychological impact of these simultaneous investments reverberated far beyond the sphere of arms. In London's drawing rooms and Manchester's counting houses, the unthinkable had occurred. A handful of Dutch farmers had seized the initiative from the world's greatest power. The stock markets that had grown fat on expansion now trembled at reports from the African front, while newspaper editors struggled to explain how the heirs of Wellington and Nelson found themselves besieged by descendants of simple pastoralists. General Sir Redvers Buller, dispatched to South Africa with the confidence of a man accustomed to colonial victories, discovered upon his arrival that the comfortable assumptions of global warfare had evaporated like morning dew. The enemy he faced bore no resemblance to the spear-wielding warriors of previous campaigns, or the poorly equipped rebels of folklore. These Republicans fought with modern armaments, wielded by marksmen whose skill had been honed through decades of hunting on the vast African plains. In the columns Buller assembled, one could see the full promise of London's military thinking, and the flaws that would haunt it. The armies at his disposal represented the flower of the Crown's professional establishment, a guards' regiments whose scarlet tunics had adorned countless victory parades, Highland battalions whose pipers had led charges across the northwest frontier, and artillery batteries whose guns had silenced opposition from India to the Sudan. Yet these same assets, magnificent in conventional combat, proved tragically unsuited to the revolutionary conflict that awaited them. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against London's ambitions. The rolling hills of Natal, broken by river valleys and crowned with rocky outcroppings that the Africans called kopjes, provided natural fortifications for defenders who understood their value. Every ridge became a potential killing ground, every river crossing a nightmare for armies trained in the open order advances of European battlefields. The Republicans, intimate with every fold in the landscape, moved through this maze of natural obstacles like hunters pursuing familiar game. December 1899 would be remembered in Crown annals as the month when certainty died, the week that began with confident predictions of swift victory ended with a sequence of defeats so stunning that they shattered the very foundations of orthodoxy. At Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso, 3 separate relief columns discovered that courage and discipline meant nothing against enemies who had mastered the deadly arithmetic of modern firepower. Stormberg unraveled with a grim sense of fate, as if the ending had been written long before the first shot was fired. General Gartacre, nicknamed General Bakacher for his legendary endurance, led his column through the darkness toward what intelligence assured him was a lightly defended position. The dawn that revealed his true situation also exposed the fundamental flaw in thinking, the assumption that European methods would prevail against any opponent, regardless of circumstances. The Republican marksman who greeted the advancing khaki lines with withering rifle fire had transformed the kopjes into an abattoir, where reputations perished alongside the men who bore them. At Magersfontein, Lord Methuen's advance toward besieged Kimberley met with an even more shocking reversal. The Highland Brigade, pride of Scotland's tradition, found itself trapped in wire entanglements that no European battlefield had prepared them to encounter. The Mauser bullets that swept their ranks carried with them the death of an era, the final extinction of the notion that valor could overcome technological innovation allied with intelligence. But it was at Colenso that the full measure of the revolution in combat became apparent. Buller himself, the Crown's most experienced colonial commander, led the assault that was meant to pierce the Republican lines defending the approaches to Ladysmith. The artillery duel that preceded the infantry advance showcased the transformation that modern armaments had wrought upon the battlefield. The guns, concealed with a skill that spoke to their intimate knowledge of the terrain, answered the bombardment with a precision that suggested professional training rather than amateur enthusiasm. The attempt to force the Tugela River crossing became a masterpiece of miscalculation. The pontoon bridges that engineers attempted to throw across the muddy waters became targets for marksmen whose accuracy turned the river into a barrier more formidable than any fortress wall. The artillery batteries that advanced to support the crossing found themselves exposed to rifle fire from positions their commanders could not even locate, let alone suppress. Colonel Long's fatal decision to advance his guns within rifle range of concealed Republican positions epitomized the confusion that had seized thinking. The naval guns that had battered down the walls of countless colonial fortresses fell silent under the accurate fire of farmers who had learned their marksmanship shooting springbok across the endless plains. The attempts to rescue the abandoned artillery became exercises in futility that consumed precious lives while achieving nothing but the confirmation of bankruptcy. Each casualty from that harrowing week added weight to a narrative no figure could fully capture. These were not the acceptable losses of colonial campaigning, but the wholesale destruction of units by an enemy that doctrine insisted could not exist. The Highland Light Infantry, the Scots Guards, and the Royal Irish Fusiliers, regiments whose battle honours stretched back centuries, found their ranks decimated by opponents who remained largely invisible throughout the engagement. In the end, the much-vaunted technological gap offered more illusion than advantage, and it came at a heavy cost. The Lee-Enfield rifles, carried by infantry, adequate against poorly armed colonial opponents, proved markedly inferior to the German Mausers in Republican hands. The difference in range, accuracy, and rate of fire translated directly into casualty figures that no amount of traditional courage could overcome. The smokeless powder that concealed firing positions while revealing others, with every volley, embodied the revolution that had transformed combat while thinking remained frozen in the previous century. The blockade operations that developed around the three trapped towns demonstrated another dimension of Republican sophistication. This was not the crude investment that commanders expected from irregular troops, but systematic operations that revealed detailed understanding of modern engineering. The trenches that appeared around Mafeking, Kimberley, and Ladysmith bore the hallmarks of professional design, while the artillery that supported these operations showed coordination that belied assumptions about capability. These initial setbacks carried consequences that stretched far beyond the borders of the war. In Berlin and St. Petersburg, in Paris and Vienna, the chancelleries of Europe watched with fascination as the world's greatest maritime power struggled against opponents that numbered fewer than the population of a medium-sized European city. The diplomatic isolation that London had cultivated as splendid suddenly seemed less magnificent when measured against the reality of universal European schadenfreude and discomfiture. The Kaiser's telegram to President Kruger, following the Jameson raid, had hinted at German interest in South African affairs, but the actual outbreak of hostilities revealed the extent to which European powers viewed embarrassment as their opportunity. The volunteers who began arriving in Republican ports from across the continent brought with them not merely additional manpower, but tangible evidence that London's enemies saw the African conflict as a chance to humble pretensions. Within the besieged towns themselves, the civilian population discovered that modern combat respected no traditional boundaries between combatant and non-combatant. The shells that fell on Mafeking's market square and Ladysmith's hospital wards carried with them the news that this conflict would be fought according to rules that no previous generation had been forced to contemplate. The rationing systems that developed within the surrounded communities became laboratories for testing human endurance under conditions that peacetime experience had never anticipated. Baden-Powell's management of the Mafeking blockade revealed both the heroism and the moral complexity that characterized this new form of combat. The theatrical flair that made him a hero to newspaper readers across the Dominion masked decisions about resource allocation that condemned African residents to starvation while preserving white civilians. The Boy Scouts who carried messages through Republican lines became symbols of plucky defiance, while African laborers died of diseases that adequate food might have prevented. At Kimberley, Cecil Rhodes discovered that personal wealth meant nothing when measured against reality. The man who had manipulated governments and precipitated international crises found himself reduced to the same dependency as any other trapped civilian. His increasingly frantic demands for immediate relief, transmitted through the telegraph lines that still connected the besieged town to the outside world, revealed the bankruptcy of the assumption that economic power automatically translated into influence. The medical services that struggled to cope with the casualties of Black Week exposed another dimension of unpreparedness. The field hospitals established to treat the wounded from Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso quickly overwhelmed the medical resources that had proved adequate for previous colonial campaigns. The enteric fever that swept through camps killed more soldiers than Republican bullets, while the rudimentary understanding of tropical medicine left medical officers helpless against diseases that turned encampments into charnel houses. Rather than ensuring control, the railway system exposed British troops, its rigid routes perfect for ambush, its dependence a growing weakness. The armoured trains that represented the pinnacle of industrial innovation proved vulnerable to simple obstacles placed across the tracks by farmers who understood that mobility, not protection, was the key to success in African combat. The reinforcements that began arriving from across the Dominion during those desperate weeks of early defeat carried with them both hope and the seeds of future transformation. The Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand contingents that disembarked at Cape Town and Durban brought not merely additional manpower, but different approaches to combat that had been shaped by frontier conditions, not unlike those that had produced Republican effectiveness. These colonial troops, raised in societies where every citizen was expected to be a marksman, and where formal discipline competed with individual initiative, proved far better adapted to South African conditions than the regular regiments of the army. The mounted rifles that formed the backbone of these contingents operated according to principles that Republican fighters would have recognized, while their officers brought to the conflict an understanding of irregular combat that regular education had failed to provide. Alongside the fighting on the ground, a quieter war raged in newspapers and salons, a fight not just for land, but for the world's sympathy and support. The correspondents who filed their dispatches from besieged towns and defeated battlefields carried to newspaper readers across the world a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of progress and civilization. The David and Goliath narrative that emerged from these early encounters resonated far beyond the immediate participants, inspiring anti-London movements from Ireland to India. While the early blows left the Dominion reeling, the deeper forces of industry and numbers slowly began to turn in its favour. The factories of Birmingham and Sheffield, the shipyards of Glasgow and Newcastle, and the training camps of Aldershot and Woolwich commenced the massive mobilization that would ultimately overwhelm Republican defiance through sheer weight of material and manpower. As 1899 drew to its close, both sides could claim victories and acknowledge defeats that transcended simple scorekeeping. The Republicans had demonstrated that global power could be successfully challenged by those who combined traditional skills with modern armaments and methods. London had learned that colonial combat in the industrial age demanded innovations that decades of tradition had failed to anticipate. With lines drawn and weapons raised, the coming fight would measure not only strategy, but the spirit and endurance of the people behind it. The quick victory that both sides had anticipated had evaporated in the gunsmoke of a dozen battlefields, leaving behind the grim realization that this conflict would be decided not by dramatic gestures, but by the unglamorous arithmetic of endurance, logistics, and national will. The year 1900 dawned over an Africa transformed by strife, where the comfortable certainties of the previous century lay buried beneath the kopjes of Natal and the Veld of the Transvaal. The real test of arms was only beginning, and with it would come revelations about the nature of modern combat that would echo through the decades to come, shaping conflicts yet undreamed of by the generals who planned their next moves in the smoke-filled tents scattered across the South African landscape. With Lord Robert's arrival in Cape Town, the tone of the war shifted, the twilight of one epoch giving way to the dawn of another. Bobs, as his soldiers called him, brought with him not merely reinforcements numbering in the tens of thousands, but a new philosophy of engagement that would transform the very nature of the South African struggle. The diminutive field marshal, his chest adorned with ribbons from a dozen campaigns across the subcontinent, embodied the accumulated wisdom of Victorian arms. Yet even his vast experience could not prepare him for the revolutionary challenge that awaited in the African landscape. The relief of Kimberley in February became the first demonstration of this new approach to battle. Where previous commanders had advanced cautiously along railway lines, Roberts launched a sweeping flanking movement that bypassed Republican strongholds entirely. The cavalry division under John French moved like a scythe across the open country, cutting communication lines and threatening the rear of positions that had seemed impregnable when approached directly. The psychological impact of this maneuver extended far beyond its immediate results. It announced that the age of static defense was ending. Piet Cronje, the grizzled veteran who had held Mafeking under siege for months, found himself caught in a trap that closed with mechanical precision. The flight to Paardeberg became a nightmare of exhaustion and desperation as the old general's wagon train struggled across country while mounted pursuers snapped at his heels like hunting dogs. The lager that Cronje established on the banks of the Modder River represented the last stand of conventional Republican arms, a circle of wagons and trenches that harked back to the heroic days of the Great Trek. On the anniversary of Majuba, the fall of Paardeberg echoed with more than military significance. It struck a chord, heavy, with historical irony and national memory. With Cronje's capitulation went not only 4,000 prisoners, but the myth of Republican invincibility that had sustained morale through the dark days of early defeats. The photographs that flashed around the world showed the legendary leader, his beard white with age and defeat, standing beside the victorious Roberts in a tableau that seemed to announce the inevitable triumph of modern organization over primitive valor. Though the headlines shouted success, more discerning voices sensed that the real struggle had only just begun. The fall of Bloemfontein in March and Pretoria in June appeared to confirm that conventional opposition was collapsing, but these territorial gains masked a more profound metamorphosis taking place within the Republican movement itself. The old leaders, who had thought in terms of formal battles and diplomatic recognition, were giving way to younger men who understood that survival demanded adaptation to entirely new forms of struggle. Christian de Wet emerged from this crucible as the prophet of a new kind of engagement. Where previous commanders had sought to hold ground and protect populations, de Wet preached the gospel of mobility and elusiveness. His philosophy was elegantly simple: strike where the enemy was weak, disappear before superior numbers could respond, and make the entire country a battlefield where no crowned soldier could ever feel secure. The mounted rifleman that he led became the prototype for a dozen others, small bands of horsemen who could appear from nowhere, inflict devastating casualties, and vanish back into the vastness of the African terrain. The evolution of the Republican system represented nothing less than a complete reimagining of how battles could be fought. The formal units that had besieged towns and fought pitched encounters dissolved into smaller bands whose strength lay not in firepower, but in knowledge of the landscape and the support of the civilian inhabitants. Every farmhouse became a potential supply depot, every kopje a possible ambush site, every valley a corridor for movement invisible to conventional reconnaissance. Jan Smuts, the young attorney who had helped draft the Transvaal Constitution, discovered within himself a genius for this new form of engagement that surprised even his closest associates. His invasion of the Cape Colony represented the ultimate expression of de Wet's philosophy, a strike deep into enemy territory, designed not to hold ground, but to demonstrate that no part of South Africa lay beyond Republican reach. The mounted riflemen that followed the former lawyer across the Orange River carried with them a message more potent than any manifesto. The struggle was far from over. Lord Kitchener's appointment as Roberts's successor brought to the South African theatre a mind that had mastered the logistics of empire from the Sudan to the northwest frontier. Yet the methodical engineer who had built the railway that carried victory up the Nile found himself confronting an enemy that refused to present convenient targets for industrial destruction. The mounted bands that melted away before his advancing columns reappeared behind his lines, striking at railways and supply convoys with a precision that turned every movement into a calculated risk. The fortified post system that the new commander devised represented the most ambitious attempt in history to impose geometric order upon a chaotic landscape. 8,000 concrete and corrugated iron positions, connected by 3,700 miles of barbed wire, began to spider across the plains like the web of some enormous predator. Each fortification became a miniature fortress manned by a handful of soldiers, whose task was to observe and report the movement of mounted bands across their assigned sector. Scattered across the conquered territories, the new camps reflected a shift in strategy, where control extended beyond the battlefield. These were not the prison compounds of previous struggles, but instruments of social engineering designed to destroy the very foundations of Republican defiance. By removing the civilian inhabitants that provided intelligence, supplies, and recruits to the mounted riflemen, the new commander sought to create a human desert where irregular operations could not survive. Emily Hobhouse arrived in South Africa as a representative of the Ladies' Committee of the South African Women and Children Distress Fund, expecting to find facilities comparable to the refugee centers she had known in Europe. What she discovered instead were scenes of systematic neglect that challenged her fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilized engagement. The mortality rates she documented, 344 deaths per 1,000 inmates, represented a humanitarian catastrophe that shocked even a world accustomed to colonial brutality. Her account, methodical yet impassioned, blended the weight of hard evidence with the urgency of conscience. The images she brought back, gaunt children and grim numbers, sparked a political reckoning that echoed through Westminster and far beyond. The woman who had travelled to South Africa as an obscure philanthropist returned as a figure whose testimony would influence policy and international opinion for decades to come. The African experience of this total struggle remained largely invisible to contemporary observers, yet the consequences for the indigenous inhabitants proved as devastating as anything endured by the white combatants. Separate detention centers housed approximately 115,000 black Africans, where mortality rates reached levels that defied rational explanation. Sol Plaatje, the young court interpreter, whose diary would become one of the few African voices preserved from this period, documented a systematic destruction of communities that had taken generations to build. Alongside the displacements came financial collapse, an intentional byproduct of a new kind of conflict that targeted livelihoods as well as lives. The destruction of farmhouses and crops, the slaughter of livestock, and the poisoning of wells transformed vast areas of the former republics into wastelands where nothing could survive. This scorched earth policy achieved its immediate objective of denying supplies to the mounted bands, but at the cost of creating a social and economic catastrophe that would influence South African development for generations. Strategy mattered, but it was the mindset of the guerrilla fighter, the patience, the adaptability that left the deeper mark on the conflict. The mounted riflemen that survived the transition from conventional to irregular engagement had undergone a profound metamorphosis in their understanding of their own identity and purpose. No longer did they fight for the preservation of established governments or the defense of fixed territories. Instead, they had become the embodiment of an idea, the notion that a people's will to freedom could not be destroyed by any amount of material force. In the bitter inders, the transformed spirit of the war found its most unyielding and defiant voice. Men like Coas de la Rey and Ben Viljoen continued the struggle not because they believed in ultimate victory, but because surrender had become unthinkable. Their bands, reduced to a few dozen men each, carried on operations that had transcended rational calculation and entered the realm of existential commitment. Yet even among the Republicans, the strain of prolonged defiance began to create fissures, that threatened the unity essential to irregular operations. The hensoppers, those who raised their hands in surrender, represented not merely defeats, but the breakdown of the social cohesion that had sustained the independence movement. The decision to collaborate with the new administration or to continue fighting became a choice that divided families and communities, with consequences that would endure long after the formal conclusion of hostilities. Intelligence operations that developed alongside these engagements revealed another dimension of the struggle's modernity. The networks of informants and double agents that both sides cultivated transformed every interaction between occupier and occupied into a potential source of crucial information. The trust that had once characterized rural communities evaporated under the pressure of suspicion and betrayal, leaving behind social wounds that would influence South African society for decades. With the eyes of the world now watching, the irregular phase turned an already unconventional conflict into something even more tangled and unpredictable. The volunteers who continued to arrive from across Europe, Irish nationalists seeking experience for their own struggle, French adventurers pursuing glory, German officers studying new forms of tactics, transformed isolated bands into laboratories for revolutionary thinking that would influence struggles around the world. Out of the smoke and dust came technologies that pointed ahead, silent markers of a new era in warfare, few yet understood. The use of barbed wire as a strategic instrument, the development of night fighting techniques, and the integration of modern communications with traditional cavalry tactics created precedents that would reappear in the trenches of the Western Front. The camouflage uniforms that replaced the traditional khaki represented a visual acknowledgement that battle had entered a new era where visibility meant death. The propaganda battle that accompanied these developments revealed the extent to which modern struggle had become a contest for the moral high ground as much as territorial advantage. The atrocity stories that both sides circulated, accounts of poisoned wells, murdered prisoners, and deliberate targeting of civilians, reflected the breakdown of the conventional rules of engagement under the pressure of total mobilization. In sustaining the resistance, women didn't just contribute, they reshaped the very idea of who counts in a conflict. The wives and daughters who provided intelligence, shelter, and supplies to the mounted bands became legitimate targets in a struggle that recognized no neutral ground. Their courage in maintaining these networks under constant surveillance demonstrated that the evolution of battle affected every aspect of society, not merely its institutions. Growing up in the shadow of war, a generation was shaped by hard truths about power, allegiance, and how to survive in a fractured world. The generation that came of age during the irregular phase carried with them memories of a world where normal social relations had collapsed under the pressure of total engagement, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust and militarization that would influence South African development for generations. Beyond the ruined farms and disrupted markets, the conflict set in motion deeper economic shifts that would outlast the fighting itself. The mining industry that had precipitated the hostilities found itself operating under conditions that bore no resemblance to the stable commercial environment that investors had anticipated. The importation of Chinese indentured laborers to replace African workers who had fled or died represented an attempt to maintain production levels that ultimately created new social tensions. The medical advances that emerged from treating the casualties of irregular operations and detention facility diseases contributed to a broader understanding of tropical medicine and public health. The doctors who struggled to fight enteric fever, typhoid, and malnutrition under field conditions developed techniques and knowledge that would prove invaluable in subsequent struggles and colonial administrations. As 1901 gave way to 1902, the mathematics of exhaustion began to assert themselves over the poetry of defiance. The mounted bands that had once numbered in the thousands were reduced to hundreds, then dozens. The horses that had provided the mobility essential to irregular tactics succumbed to disease and malnutrition, forcing proud mounted riflemen to continue their struggle on foot. The arms and ammunition that had sustained the opposition for 3 years became increasingly difficult to obtain as the fortified system tightened its grip on the movement of supplies. By the time negotiations began in earnest, both sides seemed to grasp that what had once held their world together no longer existed. The men who gathered to discuss terms were no longer the confident leaders of established republics, but the representatives of peoples that had been scattered, impoverished, and traumatized by 3 years of total engagement. Choosing to accept the terms marked the final turn in a conflict that had already transformed itself time and again. The irregular fighters who laid down their arms at Vereeniging were not the same men who had ridden out from their farms in October 1899. They had become something new, the survivors of the first modern engagement, carriers of experiences and knowledge that would influence the development of tactical thinking around the world. The legacy of this irregular phase would extend far beyond the immediate participants or even the boundaries of South Africa. The tactics developed on the African plains would reappear in Ireland and Palestine, in China and Cuba. The social changes wrought by total engagement would provide models for revolutionary movements from Mexico to Russia. The detention facilities that began as expedients would evolve into instruments of social control that would cast their shadow across the 20th century. As the last shots of the Second Anglo-Boer hostilities echoed across the silent landscape, both victors and vanquished could claim to have participated in something unprecedented in human history. They had fought the first struggle of the modern era, an engagement that had transformed not merely the political map of Southern Africa, but the very nature of armed conflict itself. The peace that followed would be built upon the ruins of assumptions about civilization, progress, and human nature that had sustained the previous century's confidence in inevitable advancement. Like a ghost ship in a sea of ash, the marquee at Vereeniging offered temporary refuge for the voices that would decide what would rise from the wreckage. Within this temporary sanctuary, 60 representatives of the former states gathered to confront the most agonizing decision in their people's history: whether to continue a struggle that had already consumed everything they held dear, or to accept terms that would preserve their physical existence while surrendering their autonomy. Each figure who passed through the tent's opening bore the scars of a war that had stripped away illusion, turning boys into battle-worn survivors of a fractured cause. Generals who had once commanded thousands now spoke for handfuls of followers who possessed little more than the rifles in their hands and the clothes on their backs. The cream of leadership, men like Louis Botha, whose tactical brilliance had kept the flame of freedom flickering through the darkest hours, found themselves weighing abstractions like honor and sovereignty against the concrete reality of children dying in detention centers across the conquered territories. The Treaty of Vereeniging, signed on May 31st, 1902, represented far more than the conclusion of a particular struggle. It marked the birth of a new form of imperial administration that would serve as a model for the 20th century's approach to incorporating resistant peoples into global systems of dominance. The document's measured phrases concealed within their diplomatic language the seeds of future tensions that would reshape not merely South Africa, but the entire continent. Article 8 of the treaty carried particular significance for the future of the subcontinent. though few of the exhausted negotiators fully grasped its implications at the time. The decision to postpone consideration of indigenous franchise until after the establishment of responsible administration effectively handed authority over the black majority to the very men who had just been defeated in the field. This apparently minor clause would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in the continent's history, establishing the legal foundation for decades of systematic disenfranchisement and exploitation. The immediate aftermath of the settlement revealed the true scale of the devastation that 3 years of total engagement had wrought upon the South landscape. The scorched earth tactics that had been employed with such ruthless efficiency left behind a moonscape of burned farmsteads, poisoned wells, and abandoned settlements. The survivors who emerged from the detention facilities found themselves strangers in their own land, confronting the task of rebuilding not merely their physical infrastructure, but their entire communal and economic order. Lord Milner's administration approached the challenge of restoration with the systematic thoroughness of a man who viewed the former states as a blank slate upon which a new civilization could be inscribed. The High Commissioner brought to his task the full confidence of Imperial engineering, convinced that the application of sufficient capital and administrative expertise could transform the backward territories into modern, efficient components of the global economy. By the summer of 1902, the return of refugees and former fighters had grown into an exodus of historic proportions, unmatched on the continent at the time. Approximately 200,000 people, whites from the detention centers, blacks from their separate facilities, and refugees who had fled to neighboring territories, required transportation, temporary shelter, and the basic necessities of life while they attempted to rebuild their shattered communities. The logistics of this operation tested the administrative capacity of the new regime, while providing the first indication of how thoroughly the fabric of the region had been torn apart. Compensation payments promised in the treaty, £3 million for restoration assistance, proved woefully inadequate to address the scale of destruction that the commissioners discovered as they travelled through the former territories. Entire districts had been depopulated, their farmhouses reduced to blackened chimneys, standing sentinel over abandoned fields. The livestock that had formed the foundation of the pastoral economy had been systematically slaughtered, leaving behind an agricultural system that would require years to rebuild, even under the most favorable circumstances. Psychological trauma inflicted upon the survivors proved even more difficult to address than the physical destruction. Families that had been separated for years struggled to re-establish relationships that had been severed by the chaos of displacement and internment. Children who had spent their formative years in the detention facilities emerged into a world that bore no resemblance to the community their parents remembered, while adults grappled with the challenge of reconstructing identities that had been shaped by loss, displacement, and defeat. Language quickly became a flashpoint in the early years of rebuilding, reflecting deeper tensions over identity, control, and the fight to endure. Milner's determination to establish English as the sole medium of instruction in schools represented more than mere administrative convenience. It reflected a comprehensive strategy to reshape the heritage landscape of the former territories. The resistance that this policy encountered from Dutch-speaking communities demonstrated the extent to which tongue had become a symbol of deeper struggles over character and autonomy. What began as an administrative effort soon fueled deeper economic change, reshaping society in ways that would outlast the memory of war itself. The mining industry, which had precipitated the original crisis, now found itself operating in an environment where workforce relations had been completely disrupted by 3 years of upheaval. The solution that emerged, the importation of Chinese indentured workers to replace the indigenous laborers who had died or fled, created new tensions while failing to address the underlying structural problems of the extractive economy. The arrival of 63,000 Chinese workers between 1904 and 1907 represented more than a temporary expedient to address workforce shortages. It marked the beginning of South Africa's metamorphosis into a laboratory for racial engineering that would influence colonial policy throughout the 20th century. The compounds that housed these workers became prototypes for the systems of domination that would later be applied to the entire indigenous citizenry, while the legal framework developed to govern their employment established precedents for the restriction of movement and association that would characterize apartheid statutes. During this period, black communities began to awaken to a stark truth. The peace had been brokered without their voices, their presence, or their consent. The formation of the Natal Indian Congress under the guidance of a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi represented one of the earliest organized responses to the new order's systematic marginalization of non-white participation. The passive resistance campaigns that Gandhi pioneered in response to discriminatory statutes would provide a model for anti-colonial movements throughout the 20th century. The emergence of Het Volk in the Transvaal and the Oranje Unie in the Orange River Colony marked the beginning of Dutch-speaking recovery from the catastrophe of defeat. The chiefs of these organizations, men like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, demonstrated remarkable pragmatism in their willingness to work within the imperial system while pursuing the restoration of self-rule. Their success in achieving responsible administration for the former territories within 4 years of the treaty represented one of the most striking examples of rehabilitation in imperial history. That year's election in the Transvaal wasn't just about leadership. It was a test of whether war-born divisions could yield to democratic cooperation. Het Volk's overwhelming victory demonstrated that the Dutch-speaking inhabitants had not been broken by defeat, but had instead been galvanized by their shared experience of suffering. The party's platform of reconciliation with English-speaking South Africans, while maintaining heritage distinctiveness, offered a model for managing ethnic divisions that would influence advancement throughout the region. With the South Africa Act of 1909, the slow march of post-war restoration reached its formal conclusion. The National Convention that met in Durban and Cape Town brought together representatives of the 4 colonies to design a federal system that would accommodate their diverse interests while creating a unified state capable of managing the subcontinent's complex racial and commercial relationships. Each compromise struck during the deliberations echoed with the unresolved strains that the war had forced into the open. The decision to establish a federation rather than a confederation represented a victory for those who favored centralized authority, while the complex arrangements for linguistic rights and provincial autonomy acknowledged the continuing divisions within the white citizenry. Most significantly, the decision to bar the indigenous majority from participation at the national level established the foundational framework for decades of white minority rule. Women's involvement in the restoration exposed a complicated truth. The era offered space to push boundaries, but those boundaries remained firmly in place. The suffering that women had endured in the detention facilities had politicized many who had previously accepted their marginalization from public life, while the practical necessities of restoration had forced communities to rely upon female guidance in unprecedented ways. Yet the new arrangements made no provision for women's participation, reflecting the continued dominance of traditional patriarchal assumptions, even among those who had experienced the most radical upheaval. Emerging from the ashes of war, the schooling system became a quiet battleground where language, culture, and power vied for influence over the next generation. The establishment of Dutch medium schools represented more than a linguistic preference. It embodied a comprehensive strategy for heritage survival that recognized schooling as the primary means of transmitting values and character to future generations. The university colleges that were founded during this period, Stellenbosch, Pretoria, and the Witwatersrand, would play crucial roles in developing the intellectual frameworks that would guide South advancement throughout the 20th century. Post-war economic policy walked a tightrope, caught between the urgent needs of recovery and the priorities of imperial power. The customs federation that was established among the four colonies created a unified market that facilitated recovery while ensuring that South advancement remained oriented towards serving imperial rather than local needs. The infrastructure investments that accompanied restoration, railways, harbours, and telegraph systems, integrated the subcontinent more thoroughly into global networks of trade and communication, while reinforcing its position as a supplier of raw materials to industrial economies. Out of this period came workforce structures that entrenched racial hierarchies, patterns that would come to define South Africa's social order. The pass law system that was extended throughout the former territories represented more than an administrative convenience. It embodied a comprehensive strategy for managing indigenous movement and ensuring a steady supply of cheap workers for the mining industry. The Glen Grey Act and similar statutes created the legal framework for limiting black land ownership while forcing participation in the wage economy. Restoration unfolded not in isolation, but under the watchful eyes of the world, a sign of how far South Africa's struggles had echoed beyond its borders. The humanitarian crisis created by the detention facilities had focused international attention on the methods employed in modern colonial pacification, while the ultimate settlement had been scrutinized as a potential model for managing similar struggles elsewhere in the empire. The League of Nations would later draw upon South precedents in developing its mandate system for administering former German colonies. Amid the rubble of conflict, a renewed interest in heritage quietly took root, an awakening that would shape the nation's identity long after the fighting had ended. The shared experience of suffering and loss had created a new sense of Dutch-speaking solidarity that transcended the regional and class divisions that had previously fragmented the community. The literature, poetry, and historical writing that emerged during this period established the mythological framework that would sustain nationalism throughout the 20th century, transforming military defeat into moral victory and powerlessness into strength. As communities struggled to heal, it was Dutch Reformed theology that gave many the language and structure to turn grief into resilience. The concept of a chosen people tested by suffering, but ultimately vindicated by divine providence, offered a framework for understanding recent events that preserved dignity while acknowledging defeat. The neo-Calvinist philosophy that emerged from this theological reflection would provide the intellectual foundation for apartheid ideology in subsequent decades. The commemorative tradition that emerged during the Restoration period created physical and symbolic markers of the recent struggle that would influence South consciousness for generations. The monuments erected to honor the women and children who had died in the detention facilities became focal points for annual remembrance ceremonies that reinforced communal solidarity while perpetuating grievances against those held responsible for their suffering. The detention center memorials, in particular, established a narrative of victimization that would be deployed to justify subsequent policies of racial marginalization and domination. As the decade of restoration drew to a close with the establishment of the Federated South Africa in 1910, the foundations had been laid for the tensions that would dominate the subcontinent throughout the 20th century. The arrangements that emerged from the settlement process had created a framework for white cooperation, while systematically barring the indigenous majority from meaningful participation in their own administration. The commercial structures that had been rebuilt after the devastation reflected the continued dominance of extractive industries that required large supplies of cheap, managed workers. Those who came of age during the restoration years carried forward the scars and lessons of a fractured society, shaping how they viewed power, race, and collective action. The children who had survived the detention facilities, the young men who had experienced defeat and recovery, and the women who had maintained their communities through the darkest hours would become the guides of a civilization that bore the permanent imprint of the transformative decade that followed Vereeniging. The settlement that had ended the Second Anglo-Boer hostilities had indeed brought reconciliation among the white inhabitants of South Africa, but it had done so at the cost of barring the majority of the subcontinent's people from the arrangements that would govern their lives. The seeds of future tensions had been planted in the very framework that celebrated the restoration of harmony among former enemies, ensuring that the questions raised by the recent struggle would resurface in new forms throughout the turbulent century that lay ahead. Forged in the aftermath of war, this generation approached politics and race with a mindset molded by hardship, exclusion, and the struggle to restore order. What had begun as a clash between two small republics and the world's greatest empire had birthed innovations in combat, statecraft, and human organization that would reshape the first half of the 20th century. The lessons learned on the Veld would be studied in staff colleges from Berlin to Tokyo, while the methods of population management pioneered in the detention camps would cast their shadow across continents, yet to experience their own dark nights of systematic subjugation. The immediate tactical legacy of the South hostilities transformed the conduct of armed engagement across the globe, with a speed that demonstrated how thoroughly the struggle had shattered traditional assumptions about the nature of contemporary battle. The trench networks that appeared along the Western Front in 1914 bore unmistakable resemblance to the defensive works that had proved so effective against advances at Margesfontein and Colenso. The machine gun techniques that would mow down millions in Flanders had been perfected by Republican commandos who understood that firepower made traditional infantry charges exercises in futility. Gone were the bright coats of parade ground glory. In their place, drab camouflage signaled a new era where battle was no longer a spectacle, but a calculated grind of destruction. When the army abandoned its scarlet tunics for the khaki first tested under skies, it acknowledged that the age of Waterloo and Balaclava had ended forever. The drab earth tones that became the universal language of dress spoke to a world where survival depended upon invisibility rather than magnificence. What began as cautious observation from above marked a turning point, setting the stage for the three-dimensional combat that would define the Great War. The observation balloons that had seemed such marvels of innovation as they drifted over the besieged towns of the Orange Free State were the primitive ancestors of the fighter aircraft that would dominate the skies over Europe within a decade. The intelligence gathered from these early aerial platforms established principles of battlefield surveillance that would evolve into the sophisticated reconnaissance networks of the interwar period. More profound than these tactical innovations was the demonstration that contemporary combat required the complete mobilization of society's resources in ways that previous generations had never contemplated. The detention facilities that had been designed as temporary expedients for managing civilian inhabitants became prototypes for the systematic administration of entire societies during periods of crisis. The administrative techniques developed for processing, categorizing, and managing tens of thousands of displaced persons would be refined and applied on an industrial scale by the authoritarian regimes that emerged from the chaos of the Great Struggle. Though the casualties were grave, the broader population, shifts, losses, and imbalances brought on by the war left an even deeper mark. The 28,000 Republican civilians who perished in the camps, most of them women and children, represented not merely a statistical tragedy, but the first systematic attempt to break the will of a resistant people through the deliberate targeting of non-combatants. This crossing of the traditional boundary between soldier and civilian established precedents that would be invoked to justify the strategic bombing campaigns and relocations that would characterize the conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s. The indigenous experience of the struggle, largely invisible to contemporary observers, presaged the continent's traumatic encounter with 20th century ideologies of ethnic hierarchy and systematic marginalization. The 14,000 black inhabitants who died in separate detention facilities suffered casualties proportionally higher than any other group, yet their sacrifice would be erased from official remembrance for generations. The pattern of selective commemoration that elevated certain victims while forgetting others would become a characteristic feature of how societies managed the recollection of mass violence. In the settlement's wake, the political structure took shape as a quiet experiment in managing race and power, one whose influence would reach across continents. The solution to the native question, the systematic exclusion of the indigenous majority from civic participation while exploiting their labor, provided a model that would be studied and adapted by colonial administrators from Kenya to Algeria. The legal frameworks developed to justify and implement these policies contributed to the emergence of scientific racism as a respectable intellectual tradition that would reach its horrific apotheosis in the fascist movements of the 1930s. War's impact on trade and production sparked changes that rippled far beyond the mines and fields, altering the structure of capitalism at its core. The techniques developed for managing large-scale industrial operations under crisis conditions, centralized planning, systematic workforce management, and the integration of multiple sectors under unified command, provided the foundation for the corporate strategies that would dominate 20th century business organization. The mining houses that emerged from the post-hostilities consolidation became prototypes for the multinational corporations that would reshape the world economy during the interwar period. These early tactics of shaping opinion didn't fade with the war. They were studied, streamlined, and ultimately mastered by the authoritarian forces that followed. The systematic use of atrocity stories to mobilize domestic support, the careful management of press access to operations, and the coordination of multiple media channels to create unified narratives of national purpose all became standard elements of 20th century statecraft. The recognition that victory in contemporary conflicts required winning the battle for public opinion as much as defeating enemy armies marked a fundamental shift in the nature of international relations. The humanitarian movement that emerged in response to the detention camp revelations created new norms regarding the treatment of civilian inhabitants during hostilities. Emily Hobhouse's meticulous documentation of camp conditions established principles of investigation and reporting that would influence the development of international law during the interwar period. The moral vocabulary that she developed to describe systematic abuses provided the foundation for the humanitarian organizations that would emerge in response to the crises of the 1930s and 1940s. Linguistic consequences of the struggle contributed to the emergence of the Dutch dialect as a literary language capable of expressing the full range of human experience. The poets and writers who emerged from the trauma of defeat and Reconstruction created a body of literature that transformed a colonial vernacular into a vehicle for sophisticated artistic expression. The cultural nationalism that grew from this linguistic renaissance would provide the intellectual foundation for the revival that would culminate in the National Party's electoral triumph in 1948. As communities rebuilt, religious belief helped reshape the narrative of loss, casting it not as failure, but as a path to deeper spiritual renewal. The development of a distinctively Calvinist theology that interpreted recent suffering as divine preparation for future greatness provided the ideological framework for the movements that would reshape politics in the decades following Union. The fusion of religious conviction with ethnic thinking that characterized this theological tradition influenced the development of similar movements around the world during the interwar period. Over time, the war's legacy was repurposed into a political tool, invoked to defend systems of separation and racial hierarchy. The annual commemorations of the detention camps created ritualized occasions for renewing communal solidarity while perpetuating grievances against those held responsible for past suffering. The transformation of historical trauma into contemporary advantage demonstrated how collective remembrance could be manipulated to serve the interests of particular groups at the expense of others. From Dublin to Beijing, rebels drew strength from the early war narrative, yet its romantic sheen hid the brutal consequences borne by civilians caught in the crossfire. The gap between the heroic mythology of guerrilla resistance and its often horrific practical consequences would become a recurring theme in the conflicts of the 1920s and 1930s. Information gathering techniques developed during the counterinsurgency phase established precedents for the observation methods that would characterize the emerging authoritarian states of the 20th century. The systematic use of informants, the creation of detailed registers, and the integration of multiple sources of information into comprehensive pictures all became standard features of dictatorial administration. The recognition that managing information was as important as managing territory marked a fundamental shift in the nature of power that would be perfected by the dictatorships of the interwar period. Medical advances that emerged from treating the casualties and the diseases that ravaged the detention facilities contributed to the development of tropical medicine and public health as systematic disciplines. The understanding of disease transmission and prevention that emerged from the experience would prove invaluable in managing the health challenges of 20th century urbanization and imperial expansion. The techniques developed for treating trauma and managing large-scale medical emergencies established precedents that would be refined during the catastrophic struggles of the following decades. The educational policies implemented during the Reconstruction period created competing school networks that institutionalized linguistic and cultural divisions within the white community, while systematically disadvantaging the indigenous majority. The dual-medium education arrangement that emerged from these policies provided a model for managing ethnic divisions that would be studied and adapted by multi-ethnic societies around the world. The recognition that educational oversight was essential for maintaining group identity and transmitting values became a central feature of the nationalist movements that would reshape Europe and the continent in the interwar period. To fuel the post-conflict mining economy, labor had to move, and that movement disrupted traditional life in ways that echoed through generations. The compound arrangement that housed migrant workers became a prototype for managing large-scale movements while maintaining order and minimizing costs. The family disruption and community breakdown that resulted from these labor patterns contributed to the pathologies that would plague industrial societies throughout the first half of the 20th century. Environmental impact of the scorched earth tactics employed during the struggle created ecological damage that would take decades to repair. The systematic destruction of farmlands, the poisoning of water sources, and the disruption of traditional land use patterns transformed vast areas of the landscape into degraded wastelands that required massive investment and careful management to restore. The recognition that contemporary combat could inflict permanent damage on the natural environment contributed to early conservation movements that would gain momentum during the interwar period. The innovations that emerged from the struggle contributed to the acceleration of the Second Industrial Revolution and the transformation of manufacturing processes. The techniques developed for mass-producing equipment, managing complex logistics networks, and coordinating large-scale operations under extreme conditions all found peacetime applications that increased industrial efficiency and reduced production costs. The marriage of traditional craftsmanship with industrial methods that characterized production provided the foundation for the consumer economy that would emerge during the 1920s. The photographic documentation of the hostilities created new standards for visual journalism that would transform the relationship between distant events and public consciousness. The images of detention camp victims, battlefield casualties, and operations that circulated in newspapers around the world established the power of photography to shape public opinion and influence decisions. The recognition that visual evidence could be more persuasive than written testimony marked the beginning of the mass media age that would define the 20th century. Diplomatic innovations that emerged from managing the dimensions of the struggle contributed to the development of new forms of organization and cooperation. The techniques developed for coordinating operations among diverse allied armies, managing humanitarian crises, and negotiating complex peace settlements all provided precedents for the institutions that would emerge after the Great Struggle. The League of Nations drew extensively on the experience in developing its procedures and protocols for managing disputes. Though it claimed to unify, the 1910 Constitution was ultimately a strategic compromise, a federal structure built to contain ethnic conflict while entrenching white rule. The complex arrangements for language rights, provincial autonomy, and ethnic exclusion provided a model that would be studied by theorists and lawyers throughout the early 20th century. The failure of this framework to provide long-term stability would demonstrate the inherent contradictions of attempting to build democratic institutions on foundations of systematic inequality. Consolidation of the Witwatersrand, goldfields under a handful of mining houses, created corporate entities with resources that rivaled those of nation-states. The techniques of industrial organization, workforce management, and capital administration that were perfected in the mines would be exported around the world, influencing the development of extractive industries from the Belgian Congo to the Canadian Arctic. The cultural renaissance that emerged from defeat and recovery created artistic traditions that would influence the development of nationalism throughout the 20th century. The literature, music, and visual arts that flourished during the decades following the hostilities demonstrated how cultural production could serve as a vehicle for mobilization and identity formation. The transformation of the vernacular from a despised dialect into a sophisticated medium of literary expression provided a model for linguistic nationalism that would be emulated by minority groups around the world. The lessons of the struggle were absorbed with particular attention by the German General Staff, whose analysis of Republican tactics would influence the development of stormtrooper techniques during the Great Struggle. The emphasis on mobility, infiltration, and the integration of infantry with artillery that characterized the most successful operations would be refined and systematized by theorists who recognized the revolutionary implications of the experience. The transformation of combat from a contest between professional armies into a struggle involving entire societies would reach its logical conclusion in the total conflicts of the mid-20th century. Techniques of monitoring, information processing, and management that were pioneered would be perfected by the authoritarian regimes of the 1930s and 1940s. The recognition that administration required comprehensive knowledge of the governed would transform the relationship between authority and citizen throughout the industrialized world. As the 46th anniversary of the struggle's conclusion approached in 1948, the long-term consequences of the hostilities would reach their ultimate expression in the electoral victory of the National Party and the formal implementation of the separation doctrine. The arrangement of ethnic separation that emerged from this transformation represented the logical culmination of the constitutional arrangements that had been established at Vereeniging and refined through 4 decades of experimentation. The struggle that had begun as a dispute over mining rights and representation had thus become the foundation for one of the most comprehensive regimes of ethnic domination in history. Bitter irony of this outcome lay in the transformation of the Republican people from victims of systematic subjugation into architects of an even more comprehensive arrangement of ethnic management. The detention facilities that had traumatized a generation of children became the inspiration for the forced removals and homeland arrangement that would displace millions of indigenous inhabitants. The techniques of managing people that had been used against the Republicans would be refined and applied with even greater ruthlessness against the indigenous majority. The observers who had condemned the use of detention facilities during the hostilities would remain largely silent as the separation doctrine institutionalized ethnic division on an unprecedented scale. The humanitarian principles that had been articulated in response to Republican suffering would prove inadequate to address the systematic subjugation of the indigenous majority. The selective application of moral outrage that had characterized responses to the struggle would continue to shape reactions to developments throughout the separation era. Its impact wasn't confined to the battlefield. The war left a lasting imprint on how societies fought, governed, and thought about race and power for decades to come. The innovations in violence and management that had been pioneered on the Veld would be refined and perfected by the authoritarian movements that would dominate the mid-century decades. The struggle that had been fought to determine the future had instead provided the template for the systematic atrocities and ethnic hierarchies that would characterize the age. The Veld that had witnessed the birth of industrial combat now lay peaceful under the sky, its battlefields marked by monuments that commemorated the dead while struggling to make sense of their sacrifice. The farmers who had fought so desperately for their independence had achieved a victory more complete and terrible than they had ever imagined. Not the preservation of their simple pastoral republic, but the creation of an arrangement of ethnic domination that would endure for nearly half a century and influence the development of ethnic thinking around the world. Far from a minor colonial clash, the war revealed what the future would hold. Brutal efficiency, managed suffering, and ideologies armed with paperwork and rifles alike. What was tested in South Africa would echo across continents, proving that modernity could march under many flags, some waving for freedom, others for fear.